Hello everyone. The 12th century. After a First Crusade, during which tens of thousands of men, coming from Western Europe, had traveled to the Holy Land and conquered it, culminating with Jerusalem in 1099, and the creation of various Christian states in the Levant. Many of the survivors had returned to where they came from. They left these states, especially the Kingdom of Jerusalem, surrounded by hostile neighbors. The Fatimids in Egypt, the Seljuk Turks in Syria and Anatolia, Turkey, and soon Byzantium too, the Eastern Roman Empire that would turn against some of them. This is what I told you about in the first part of this history of the Crusades. And for tonight, we will continue the story in this second part. The second part of 3, because contrary to what I said in the first part, this is finally going to be in 3 episodes. The saga of the Crusades is far from over. We have just begun. A new century begins after the First Crusade, the 12th century. And tonight, we will relive the Second Crusade, the rise of Saladin, the emergence of religious military orders like the Knights Templar, and more aspects of the Crusades, diplomatic, military, or social. The repercussions were not limited to fights in the Near East. They extended to European trade, to politics. They had consequences such as the rise of Italian cities like Venice or Genoa, but also the development of persecutions, especially against European Jews. They also affected architecture, warfare, or science. In this second part, we will continue to explore all this. But don't worry, we will take things one by one to understand the context and what happened. All you have to do is relax and find a comfortable position. You may close your eyes if you wish. You only need to listen. And if you fall asleep, you have chapters, timestamps on your screen and the pinned comment to help you resume where you left. As usual, you will also find the links to Patreon and audio streaming sites if you prefer to listen to my stories there. On Patreon, if you decide to join, you can download all the stories, get previews and surveys, and you contribute to keep this channel free of ad breaks for everyone. Now take a deep breath. Let the tension go in your shoulders. And let's go back to the year 1099 to see what happened. As we saw at the end of part 1, when the First Crusade ended and Crusaders returned, it was considered a major success. And militarily, it was. Despite the rivalries between the leaders of the Crusade and all the casualties, the Crusade had achieved its goals of conquering Jerusalem, of giving air to Byzantium by pushing back the Seljuks, these Turkish people that had erupted in the Middle East in the 11th century at the expense of the Abbasid caliphs and at the expense of Byzantium, and finally, symbolically, it was the most significant pushback of Christians against Muslims since the Muslim expansion of the 7th century. But it didn't mean it was a very solid victory, with gains that would be sustainable. First, because the conquest had been brutal. I told you in part 1 about the lootings and exactions of Crusader armies on their way, as they crossed regions like Anatolia, Syria, and Palestine, where lived Christian, Muslim, and to a lesser extent Jewish communities. They didn't gain much popular support. Second, because relations with Byzantium had soared. One of the goals of the First Crusade was to rescue Byzantium, which had fallen to a low point by the end of the 11th century and lost almost all its territories east of Constantinople. Byzantium could take back some of them, thanks to the Crusade, like the city of Nicaea. But relations with the Crusaders were tense from the beginning, because the Crusader armies demanded food and supplies and threatened to take it by force. Also because Byzantium never provided the military help it had committed to, and it worsened when the Crusaders did not return conquered territories as promised. On top of this, some of the leaders of the Crusade, like Bohemond of Taranto, were former enemies of Byzantium, who had attacked the Byzantines from their bases in the south of Italy before the Crusade. So each side accused the other of treason. And a third reason that made the position of the new Crusader states precarious was that the Muslims had just been repelled. The Middle East was still dominated by powerful Islamic states. In Egypt and the rest of North Africa, there were the Fatimids. Ruling from Baghdad were the Abbasid caliphs, weakened and themselves challenged by invaders, but they still held large regions in Mesopotamia and had influence in the entire Islamic world because of their status, their prestige as caliphs. And there were the Seljuk Turks that had been the main opponents of the Crusaders' army on its way from Constantinople to the Holy Land. They had been defeated several times, but not destroyed, far from that. Their lands were still vast. So in front of these large states with populations of several millions, the few thousand crusaders who had stayed to defend the 4 Latin states on the coast of the Levant, this wasn't much. The conflict to just hold their positions and secure the frontiers of their small states continued, with a lower intensity after the Battle of Ascalon that I told you about at the end of the previous part. The Battle of Ascalon is when the remains of the Crusaders' army, led by Raymond of Toulouse and Godfrey of Bouillon, repelled the main Fatimid force in Palestine in 1099. After that, there were no imminent threat left, and the First Crusade was considered over. But the war with Muslims went on, and on top of that, another war started quickly between Byzantium and the Principality of Antioch, the one created by their old enemy, Bohemond of Taranto. The Byzantines considered Antioch rightfully theirs, and they were trying to get it back. So, very quickly, the Crusader state called for help. They were ruled by lords who had plenty of ties in France and the south of Italy. They had their own domains there that could provide reinforcement, and they called friends and allies to their rescue, helped by the prestige they had gained during the First Crusade. And they also had support from the papacy, from the Catholic Church. So, in the first years of the 12th century, several expeditions answered and departed Western Europe. From Lombardy in Italy, from the Rhine region and northern France, several armies came to the rescue in 1101. This wave was a total failure. The Turks had regrouped and they decimated these rescue armies on their way in Anatolia before they even reached the Crusader states. There was another expedition coming from Norway this time between 1107 and 1110. Rather than a rescue operation, it was an armed pilgrimage by the Christian king of Norway, Sigurd Jorsalfar. This Norwegian expedition was more helpful. It arrived by sea and avoided the very dangerous route through Anatolia. It could help the Crusaders in a siege to take the city of Sidon on the coast of modern Lebanon. In the years 1110, the Seljuks intensified their attacks, especially against the county of Edessa, and the call for help from Crusader states became structural, constant. They needed a flow of knights and foot soldiers just to keep existing. Another significant relief effort was the so-called Venetian Crusade of 1122 to 1124. This can get a bit confusing. There are several main crusades, 8 in total, that happened over 2 centuries. But these main crusades got a number because they were initiated by high lords or kings with vocal support from the popes, and they were relatively large-scale operations. Apart from them, dozens more expeditions or efforts became known also as crusades over several centuries. These include relief efforts to the Middle East, like the ones I just mentioned, and also other wars against non-Christians that received official support from Rome. That included the war in Spain, the Reconquest, the Reconquista, against the Umayyads. This struggle was proclaimed a crusade in 1123, that is 24 years after the fall of Jerusalem in the First Crusade. Later there would be other operations against the Slavs in Eastern Europe, against Finnic peoples called the Northern Crusades, and these crusades that were no longer aimed at the Holy Land in the Middle East lasted until the Renaissance. They also included calls to crusades against internal enemies, against heretics, like heretical Christian sects before the Reformation, and when the Reformation began to approach, movements that were sometimes called proto-Protestant, or also against the Ottomans, the Turks, the rising power in the 15th century, by the end of the Middle Ages. Many of these wars or expeditions were called crusades retroactively, sometimes centuries later. But early on, they were inspired by the First Crusade, These were all mobilizations with a defined target, a goal. Their rhetoric, the symbols they used, their religious dimension, all of this were present in all of them. So the crusade became a form of war, defensive or offensive for conquest, sanctioned by the Catholic Church. Obviously, under this blanket term of crusade, you find very different conflicts and motivations that sometimes had more to see with ambition or expansionism than anything else. But if we take a broader look at the phenomenon that happened between the late 11th century and the Renaissance, the end of the Middle Ages, what we see is Western Europe turning more expansionist, beginning to project itself. This happened over a long period of several centuries, including huge setbacks and internal wars. There would be the 100 Years' War and many other conflicts. There would also be disastrous epidemics, like the Great Plague, that wiped out a third of the European population. So this was not a straightforward move, a quick evolution at all. And if we look at world history, at global history, in the late Middle Ages, that is to say the 12th to the 15th centuries, Europe was still not at the center of the most important changes and conquests that happened. That would probably be the Mongols and other Asian empires. But still, there was a change of foot, a change of mindset that made Christian Europe more and more outward-looking, more adventurous, in a sense. The Crusades are one aspect of it, but together with these religious wars, we can see that Italian cities began to expand their trade networks to the east, including as far as China with Marco Polo from Venice. Another aspect is the exploration of the Atlantic Ocean decades before Christopher Columbus. And even internally, despite the devastation of plagues and wars, there was a long-term growth of cities, a slow increase in the yields of agriculture, and systematic gains of arable lands on forests. This was very slow and imperceptible from one generation to the next. So there was no sense of linear progress at all at the time, and there was no systematic expansion strategy. But deep down, something was happening in Western Europe, something was shifting in terms of culture, of economy, technique. A new way to look at the rest of the world with ambition and appetite, rather than fear or indifference. So it could be argued that somehow this prepared the rise of Europe and how it would turn global in modern times, starting during the times of the Renaissance. Nothing of this was necessarily written in advance, but it is interesting to consider that if we leave aside military, political, moral or religious considerations for a moment, the Crusades are one aspect of a broader process. They reflected it and they participated in it. As we will see later in our story, they also favored innovations, the transmission of knowledge and techniques old and new, from Byzantium and the Muslim world to Western Europe. To conclude on this aspect, This is why historians specialized in the Middle Ages reject this perception that it was an age of stagnation or pure obscurantism, and with good reasons. It was not a period of fast, spectacular progress, of course, and if we look at it with our modern set of values, it is easy to see it as violent, unjust, and intolerant. But this kind of moral judgment doesn't help understand the causes and consequences, and it also disregards the diversity of views, of thought, all the conflicts and exceptions that characterize the medieval period, and also these major changes to medieval societies over almost 1,000 years. It ended very different from what it was at the beginning. Now, returning to the Middle East in the first decades of the 12th century, I told you that Crusader states were struggling to defend their borders, and that they depended on the support that came from Europe. Knights deciding to do a pilgrimage and stayed in the Holy Land fighting with the Crusaders, or rescue expeditions like the ones I mentioned earlier from Italy, France or Norway. But they were in survival mode, and it couldn't last forever. In 1144, the city of Edessa fell to a Turkish chief, Zengi, short for Imad al-Din Zengi. Edessa had become the capital of the county of Edessa. This state created in 1099 by Baldwin of Boulogne, in a separate expedition after he split his armies from the main body of the Crusaders' force. I told you all about it in the first part of the story. There had been highs and lows in the struggle of Crusader states. But this, the fall of Edessa, and the actual elimination of one of the 4 Crusader states, this was the biggest blow to date since 1099. Until then, even though the situation on the ground was not brilliant, seen from Western Europe, the First Crusade had been a brilliant and lasting success. 45 years after the conquest of Jerusalem, Christian states still held the coast of the Levant, from Syria to Palestine. So the fall of Edessa was a wake-up call. The work of the First Crusade was at risk of being completely undone. And interestingly, the conqueror of Edessa, Zengi, introduced a strong religious rhetoric in his campaigns against Crusader states to mobilize troops and rally support. The Muslims had perceived from the start of the First Crusade that to the Christians it was a religious war first and foremost. But as we saw in part 1, Anatolia, Syria and Palestine were plagued by wars and invasions during the 11th century, long before the arrival of the Crusaders. So, to the Muslims, this was another invasion to face, yet another actor in the Near East alongside the Byzantines, the Fatimids, the Abbasids or the Seljuks. Until Zengi, there was no large mobilization on the Muslim side using religious rhetoric. No attempt to turn this conflict into a holy war around the control of holy places. Even though, to the Muslims, Jerusalem was also a sacred city, the 3rd holiest after Mecca and Medina. The Quran mentions that the Prophet Muhammad reached Jerusalem during a miraculous night journey of prayer. and so soon after the city fell to the Muslims, a prayer house and then a large mosque were erected on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, a hill in the old city of Jerusalem that is sacred in Judaism. This is where the tradition locates the first temple built by King Solomon and the second temple that was built in the 6th century BC, after the first one was destroyed by the Babylonians. The second temple was also destroyed by the Romans in the 1st century BC, and its remain, the Western Wall, also known as the Wailing Wall, is holy to the Jews due to its proximity to Temple Mount. It has become a place of pilgrimage, we could say by default, because the most sacred site in the Jewish faith lied behind it. It was the inner sanctuary of the temple, where, according to the Hebrew Bible, God's presence appeared, and the Ark of the Covenant was kept. The Western Wall became a symbol of all that had been lost. So, when Jerusalem fell under Islamic control in the 7th century, during the First Caliphate, a small monument was erected there on the Temple Mount. And later, the Umayyads, during the Second Caliphate, another thing I told you about in part 1, the Umayyads ruled the Muslim Empire for 90 years, from their capital in Syria, Damascus. So the Umayyads ordered a large mosque to be built, Al-Aqsa. Al-Aqsa means the furthest, a reference to the distance between Mecca and Jerusalem, and also the supreme. This site and the Al-Aqsa Mosque received a lot of attention from the 8th to the 11th century, from different Muslim rulers, which cemented the importance of Jerusalem to the Muslims. The mosque was destroyed twice by earthquakes in the 8th and in the 11th centuries, but each time it was rebuilt. When Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders in 1099, Al-Aqsa had been rebuilt 60 years earlier by the Fatimids, who had controlled the Holy Land for a good part of the century. The modern mosque still has this 11th century outline, but it looks different now, because many renovations, repairs and expansions were undertaken over the following 1,000 years by the different controllers of the city, including the Mamluks and the Ottomans. So that's for the importance of Jerusalem in Islam and Judaism. Now for Christians, Jerusalem is mentioned abundantly in the Old and New Testaments. The Old Testament, obviously, because it is the translation of Hebrew texts, and the New Testament, because it is in Jerusalem that the New Testament tells of the last days, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So from the 4th century, that is to say when Jerusalem was Roman, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, was built in the Old City. It is believed to be built on the sites of Jesus' crucifixion and the site of his tomb, the place of his resurrection. The church was also damaged, rebuilt and renovated multiple times since the 4th century, and this was, and still is, the first destination of Christian pilgrims to Jerusalem. So in summary, this is why Jerusalem is a holy city to 3 religions: their scriptures mention it, but the attachment to the site built up for each of them along centuries and centuries of history, with all the fervor and also the tensions that this implies. I was telling you all this because from the years 1130, 1140, the religious rhetoric mounted on the Muslim side, mirroring the Christian rhetoric. And Zengi, the conqueror of Edessa, could unite behind him several chiefs in Syria by promoting the idea that this war against the Crusaders was jihad, that is to say, a holy war. Nowadays, the term jihad, which is an Arabic word that means striving or struggling, is generally translated as holy war. It implies violence, and in that sense it is the Islamic equivalent of crusade. But the concept of jihad is much broader than that. It can refer to any effort, any struggle to conform to God's guidance, including struggling against one's own inclinations. It can be internal. It is the concept of effort with a praiseworthy goal. But in any case, from this moment on, the different Muslim leaders that would oppose Christian crusaders in the following decades would be inclined to also label the wars as religious, holy. There was probably sincerity in this, but very much like for the Christians, it was also a good way of mobilizing their men and gathering political support. But for now, there was great consternation in Christendom when the news that Edessa had been lost reached Western Europe. And the reaction was quick. In 1145, the following year, the Pope, Eugene III, recently elected, called for a new large crusade. And because it would be an ambitious operation, led by kings this time, it was called the Second Crusade. Even though the First Crusade had been a success, the popes and rulers of Christian states had noted that it had had its weaknesses. The campaign had been chaotic due to logistics. Crusaders' armies had crossed Europe, sometimes living on pillages on their way to Constantinople. Chaotic also due to the emergence of the People's Crusade, which had been useless and sent thousands to their death. And even more chaotic due to the lack of unity in the Crusaders' army. Each lord had their troops. They had often argued, split, and it had been almost miraculous that they had reached and captured Jerusalem with what remained of an initially much larger force. So this time, they wanted none of that. The Pope called for a more organized and centralized effort. Two kings answered the Pope's call, Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany of the Holy Roman Empire. With them, many lesser nobles, French and German, also joined the crusade, and in total, a force of about 35,000 would depart for the Levant. It was less than the First Crusade, a third to a half of the numbers that had travelled in 1096-1097. This could suggest that the enthusiasm was a bit less, even though such armies were still very large for the time. But another reason is that the Second Crusade was broadened broadened to the war in Spain, in the Iberian Peninsula, between the Christians in the north and the Muslims, the Moors, in the south. This centuries-long conflict called the Reconquista, the Reconquest. Warriors who would fight in Spain would get the same guarantees from the Pope of remission of sins, and this helped the cause of Iberian kingdoms. They advanced to the south, but it also diverted thousands of crusaders to this second front, maybe for the best on the Christian side, because as we're going to see, this Second Crusade was a major failure in the east, and 10 or 20,000 more men would probably not have made much difference. But in the Iberian Peninsula, an army came by ship from England, a combined force of 13,000 Flemish, Dutch, Norman, English, Scottish, and German crusaders. They were on their way to the Holy Land, but they stopped in Portugal, as they were navigating in front of it in the Atlantic. And they joined a Portuguese army of 7,000 in the capture of Lisbon, an important event because Lisbon was taken and would stay in the hands of the Kingdom of Portugal. It remained a major Christian city for the rest of the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula. At the same time, in Anatolia, though, east of Constantinople, the armies of Louis VII and Conrad III had marched separately, and they were defeated also separately by the Seljuks. The two kings could escape with the remnants of their armies, and they both could reach Jerusalem. From there they participated in an attempt to siege Damascus in Syria, which also failed, and they did not even try to reach Edessa and retake it. After that, the armies they had brought were lost, and this made very little difference in the Levant. The county of Edessa would never reappear, leaving only 3 Crusader states: Antioch, the Principality of Antioch, and the county of Tripoli, both under huge pressure from the Muslims, and the larger kingdom of Jerusalem. The Second Crusade ended in 1149, without changing the balance of power in the Holy Land. And if anything, it showed the Muslims that the Crusaders could be defeated even in large numbers, something that had not really happened until then. The First Crusade had won all its large battles, even when it had suffered big losses in the process. But the Second Crusade was terribly unsuccessful. Now, apart from regular armies and relief expeditions, another type of organization was gaining importance in these Christian states: religious military orders, such as the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitalier, or the Order of the Holy Sepulchre. What were these orders, and why were they relevant? Military orders were religious societies of knights created to defend Christendom, and their members were not part of the clergy, but they took religious vows, such as vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And they would not fulfill their commitment through a life of prayer in a monastery, but as fighters, either to protect pilgrims or as combatants to defend the church or expand Christendom. The orders owned houses called commanderies, and they had a strict hierarchy, with a Grand Master at the top. This kind of organization was not exactly born with the Crusade. They appeared shortly before the First Crusade. In 1053, so a bit more than 40 years before the First Crusade, the Pope, Leo IX, created one, the Knights of St. Peter, and he did this to counter the Normans. I mentioned in the previous part that there were Norman incursions, expeditions, to the south of Italy in the 11th century. They ended up establishing fiefdoms there. And so it is in this context that the First Order was founded as a militia to counter this Norman invasion. From the beginning, the popes, the Church in general, saw these orders favorably as a way to channel the devotion of European nobles toward achieving their temporal goals. So they encouraged such orders by recognizing them. And after the First Crusade, in those years when Crusader states were struggling to defend themselves, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem received a flow of Christian pilgrims, several orders appeared in the Holy Land, including the most influential and largest of them all, the Knights Templar, that were founded in 1118. Before them, 15 years earlier, in 1103, there had been the Order of the Holy Sepulchre, founded by Godfrey of Bouillon, originally as an association of knights who guarded the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. 10 years later, appeared the Knights Hospitalier, originally to support a hospital dedicated to John the Baptist in Jerusalem, that provided care for pilgrims. The Knights Hospitalier became a powerful organization that had its siege, its headquarters in Jerusalem, and received a charter from the Pope that made it charged with the care and defense of the Holy Land. That is to say, something much broader than taking care of the original hospital. But this is where their name comes from. Later, in the 15th century, the Knights Hospitalier moved to the island of Rhodes, that was under their control, until the Ottomans expelled them in the 16th century, and they moved to Malta under the protection of Spain. The Knights Templar also started as a society of knights, but of all these orders, it is the one that had the most extraordinary growth. Temple Knights wore distinctive white mantles with a red cross, and from the years 1150, after the Second Crusade, they increasingly engaged militarily in many of the battles and sieges in the Holy Land. As the order became significant as a military force in the Levant, it also opened more and more headquarters, commanderies, across Christendom, becoming a kind of multinational organization tied to the Crusades. They didn't just defend pilgrims during their journey, they also collected enormous donations and started to provide financial services to pilgrims and crusaders. For example, European nobles who needed to fund their journey to the Holy Land could sell them or mortgage them their assets. They received a voucher, a letter of credit, that they could easily take with them, and once arrived in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, or during their journey, they could obtain money, equipment, or accommodation. Thanks to their credit with the order, they could just go to any commandery of the Knights Templar. This is the oldest known example of international financial services. So the Knights Templar became extremely wealthy as an order, and even became bankers to the kings. At the peak of their order, there were 15,000 to 20,000 members, but only 10% of them were knights, who actually fought. The other 90% were non-combatants, administrators, and people in support positions. Individually, the members owned nothing. They had taken vows of poverty, and the order provided for them. But the order itself, the organization, was rich, so rich that it began buying land and properties. It granted loans, it managed farms and vineyards. It even became involved in manufacturing and trade, quite far from its original vocation. At one point, the Knights Templar even owned the entire island of Cyprus. And this is why some historians have called the Knights Templar the first example of multinational corporation. They had started as a religious order, but in a matter of decades, they had turned into something else, or at least much more than a society of pious knights. Still, this human and financial contribution helped keep the Christian presence in the Near East alive for the remainder of the 12th century. But their wealth and power ultimately became their downfall. In the early 14th century, that is to say almost 200 years after their foundation, most of Christian holdings tied to the Crusades had been lost. We will see that later with the story of ulterior crusades. And so the Knights Templar had become more and more an Europe-based organization. Their original reason to be had vanished, or weakened at least, but the order was wealthier than ever. They were international, but their center of gravity was in France, and the order had lent a lot of money to the king, Philip IV, to fund his campaigns, especially since at the time Philip IV was at war with England. The crown had no means to repay that debt, and found itself in financial trouble. At the same time, the Pope, now based in Avignon, in the south of France, and no longer in Rome, was under strong influence from the French crown, and also had reasons to resent an order that had become too powerful and influent. Why had the popes left Rome? Because in the early 14th century, Rome was out of center and had lost importance as a city. And also the King of France, Philip IV, wanted to keep the papacy close at hand and was in a position to demand it. The city of Avignon, in the southeast of France, was seen as a better strategic location for the papacy. It was connected to Western and Northern Europe, the heart of Christendom, by the Rhone River. The city was already significant, developed, and so between the need to find a siege for the popes and the pressure from Philip IV, who was in a strong enough position to make demands, an agreement was found to have the popes living in Avignon with their court. This arrangement lasted for almost the whole 14th century, after which there was a conflict in Christendom, a schism, with competing popes in Avignon and Rome, until the papacy reunited and returned to Italy. So in the years 1300, the Knights Templar had at the same time the King of France and the Pope turning against them, which would be their downfall. Claims were made against the order without any actual evidence, but very serious claims, telling that the Knights Templar had turned unchristian, that they forced recruits to spit on the cross, that they worshipped idols, or that they engaged in indecent kissing or homosexual practices. This was all meant to discredit them and justify the suppression of the order. These claims and the secrecy of the order installed different legends around the Knights Templar. That they would have hidden a fabulous treasure that was never retrieved, or that they worshipped a mysterious deity called Baphomet. I will tell you about all this in an upcoming mystery story. But more concretely, the consequence was the elimination of the order and the seizing, the confiscation of its possessions. That bailed out Philip IV. The Grand Master at the time was a man called Jacques de Molay, and with his close circle, all the leaders were executed. Then thousands of other Templars were either arrested and tried, but most of them were not convicted, or they joined other orders, and some even just returned to civilian life without more consequences, now that their order had been dissolved. Returning to 1149 and the failure of the Second Crusade, we had left the three Crusader states on the defensive. But after 50 years of existence, they were now part of the landscape in the Levant, and their relative weakness left them no other option than find alliances, including with Muslims. As we have seen before, the Muslims were not unified at all. There were the Fatimids in Egypt, the Seljuk Turks, themselves with different and competing factions, the Abbasid Caliphate, with its capital in Baghdad, trying to hang to its territories, and all these factions were in competition. The conqueror of Edessa, Zengi, the one who had eliminated the county of Edessa and triggered the Second Crusade, had died. But he left behind a dynasty, the Zengids. The new Zengid ruler, Nur ad-Din, managed to unify Syria. But he was also at war with other enemies, and so an alliance was formed between the Zengids and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. If you remember, Zengi had called to jihad against the Christians, and the Crusaders were initially opposing the idea of any alliance with the Muslims. But out of necessity, both parties had to tone down their rhetoric and their principles. Nur ad-Din also allied with the Byzantines against the Seljuk Turks. Ethnically, the Zengids were Kurdish. They came from Kurdistan, in the north of Mesopotamia and the southeast of Anatolia. By the middle of the 12th century, they were a rising power in the Middle East, holding large territories in and around Syria, including Damascus, the main city. The Zengid monarch, Nur ad-Din, tried also to gain influence at the court of the Fatimids, and so he sent to Egypt one of his generals with the general's nephew, who would soon become famous and very powerful under the epithet of Saladin. Once in Egypt, at the court of the Fatimids, Saladin climbed the ranks of the Fatimid government, after fighting alongside the Fatimids against Crusader assaults. The same Crusaders who were also allied to the Zengids, where he came from. As you see, diplomacy at the time was messy. Saladin had a meteoric rise at the Fatimids' court, and he was appointed vizier in 1169, aged 32. The vizier was a kind of prime minister. Following the death of the Fatimid Caliph 2 years later, he took control of the Fatimid state and abolished this Fatimid Caliphate. Why did he do this? Saladin was Sunni, and the Fatimid Caliphate was Shia. The two main denominations, traditions in Islam. For decades, there had been this competition between two rival caliphates, the Shia Fatimids in North Africa and the Sunni Abbasids in Mesopotamia. Saladin realigned the Fatimid state with the Abbasid Caliphate. He recognized the religious authority of the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. But he didn't cede control at all. He kept control of the Fatimid state, pacified it, and turned against the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the years 1170. In 1175, aged 38, he expanded to Syria against the Zengid faction he had originally come from. And after brilliant military operations, he took control of Syria. He was on good terms with the Abbasids, having abolished the Fatimid Caliphate, and the Abbasid Caliph proclaimed Saladin Sultan of Egypt and Syria. He was now at the head of a state almost entirely enveloping the three surviving Crusader states. The rise of Saladin and the unification of a big chunk of the Middle East under him was terrible news for the Crusaders. They had been able to exploit the divisions of the Muslims during the First Crusade and the following decades. But now the Muslims were unified, at least the ones they were in contact with, and with a powerful and astute master at their head, who was well decided to expel them. The Kingdom of Jerusalem would mobilize everything it had to survive. But its situation now looked very complicated, almost tragic. In 1174, while Saladin was busy expanding his power and prepared to take Syria, a new king rose to the throne of Jerusalem, Baldwin IV, also known as the Leper King. He was a teenager, 13 at the time, and was not expected to live long because he suffered from leprosy since childhood. And along his life, his hands and face became increasingly disfigured. Despite this, and to almost everyone's surprise, he showed considerable determination and fought in battles personally, despite gradually losing sensation in his limbs. In 1177, against all odds, the Crusaders repelled the forces of Saladin at the Battle of Montgisard, even though they were outnumbered. Baldwin was 16 at the time, and he participated in this battle, and earned a lot of prestige with this victory. His courage despite his condition, plus the fact that he was progressively disfigured by leprosy, this created an aura of respect and admiration around him, which did a lot to prolong the days of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. against the forces of Saladin, but also against internal feuds and conspiracies between nobles who were anticipating his succession. He could never marry and have children due to illness, and the Counts of Tripoli, Raymond III, and the Prince of Antioch, Bohemond III, the two other Crusader states, were actively plotting to take control of Jerusalem when he would die. Baldwin tried to prepare his succession by marrying his sister to Guy of Lusignan, a knight, who ultimately succeeded him. But all these intrigues forced him to stay on the throne until his death, instead of abdicating as he intended. He repelled Saladin again in 1182, aged 21, but his illness was approaching terminal stage. The following year, he became blind and unable to walk. He died in 1185, aged 24, and at this point, the situation of the Kingdom of Jerusalem had become hopeless. Saladin had defeated the Franks twice in 1187, capturing many of their leaders, including Guy de Lusignan, the new king. And so in 1187, the Kingdom of Jerusalem collapsed. All of Palestine fell back to Muslim hands, including the city of Jerusalem later in the same year. After 88 years, the Holy City was lost, and the legacy of conquest of the First Crusade was almost erased by this loss, save for the existence of the Principality of Antioch and the County of Tripoli, now reduced to enclaves with little space around their capitals. The news of these disasters reached Europe in 1187 and 1188, and like after the fall of Edessa 43 years earlier, it caused a big commotion. The Pope, now Gregory VIII, urged all Christians to take up arms and go to the aid of their brothers in faith in the occupied Kingdom of Jerusalem. So in practice he called for a new crusade, the third one, to be led by Frederick Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor, and Richard I of England, better known as Richard the Lionheart. They were joined by a third king, Philip II of France. This trio, at the time, were the three most powerful sovereigns of Christendom, and hopes were that their combined strength would be able to repel Saladin and restore the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But who were these three kings? Frederick Barbarossa, in 1188, had been the Holy Roman Emperor, that is to say, the elected head of this confederation of small states in Germany and northern Italy, for 32 years, and at the time of the call for the Third Crusade, he had considerable authority. He was 66, a very respectable age for the time, but apart from his longevity, he had shown great ambition, military skills, and political ability for 3 decades, which made him appear almost superhuman to his contemporaries. Barbarossa, which means Redbeard in Italian, is a nickname he got after campaigns in Italy. His emperor name was Frederick I. As Holy Roman Emperor, and with his own fiefdoms, he could raise thousands of men, and he traveled to the east with 12,000 to 20,000 troops including 3,000 to 4,000 knights. Richard I was younger, 31, in 1188, and he actually became Richard I of England the following year, in 1189. But when he took the cross, that is to say, he joined the crusade, he was already the ruler of large territories in France. He was Duke of Normandy, Aquitaine, and Gascony, and Count of Poitiers. All of these were in the west of France. It is another story, but you remember King Louis VII of France in the Second Crusade. His wife was Eleanor of Aquitaine, heiress to large lands in the southwest of France. Louis VII and her became estranged, and their marriage was finally dissolved. Eleanor then went on to remarry with Henry, the father of Richard the Lionheart, of Richard I, at the time Duke of Normandy and future King of England. As a result of their union, almost a third of France, Normandy, Poitou, Aquitaine, Gascony, became possessions of the same family, the House of Plantagenet, which happened to also be kings of England, since the Dukes of Normandy, since William the Conqueror, had taken the throne, the crown of England. This was the starting point of many conflicts that were only settled 300 years later, at the end of the 100 Years' War. But for now, in 1188, this made Richard I the heir of a small empire in Western Europe, including also England, when he became king at Henry's death. Even before departing for the Third Crusade, Richard had already acquired a reputation as a military leader, and his fame would only grow during the Crusade, as we will see. The third king was Philip II of France, also known as Philip August, another major figure of medieval history. His reign would be long, more than 40 years, and when he departed for the Crusade, he had been reigning for 8 years only. Philip was well decided to reinforce royal power in France at the expense of his vassals, the various lords of the kingdom. And after he came back from the Crusade, he became a very successful king. He took back large territories from the Plantagenets, defeating them after the Third Crusade at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214. An important date because short-term it reinforced the authority of the kings in France. But in England it had the opposite effect, and a consequence of that was the imposition of the Magna Carta, a royal charter of rights that English nobles obtained from King John of England. But that would happen later. In 1188, as the Third Crusade was about to depart, Philip II, not yet Philip August because his accomplishments would come later, ruled over a relatively prosperous kingdom, and was nominally suzerain to the Plantagenets for their possessions on the continent. Nominally because, in practice, the Plantagenets and the Capetians, the dynasty of Philip II, were already in conflict. A truce was agreed upon for the Crusade, and in 1189, to the 12,000 to 20,000 troops provided by Frederick Barbarossa, Richard added about 10,000 English, Norman, Welsh, and Aquitanian from his different lands, and Philip 7,000 French. 7,000 to 40,000 more from the rest of Europe and from the Crusader states would also participate in this operation, making the Third Crusade the largest mobilization since the First Crusade. Would the three kings stay united, and could they beat Saladin, who was waiting for them in the Near East? This, and many more ulterior events, is what we will explore in the third and final part of this story. That will be available soon. For now, we have reached the end of this second episode of the history of the Crusades. You can now let go and fall asleep, or pick another story from my library. I'll be back soon with the final chapter, and in the meantime, sleep well, sweet dreams, au revoir.